At Whitmore Estate Auctions in Chicago, antique appraiser and historian Dr. Jennifer Walsh discovered a photograph that would haunt her professional curiosity for months. Hidden among boxes of personal effects from the recently deceased Millicent Ashford, she found an elegant studio portrait that immediately commanded attention. The sepia-toned photograph, mounted on thick cream cardboard typical of 1920s professional portraiture, showed two well-dressed women posed in what appeared to be a luxurious drawing room. The studio's embossed mark identified it as Sterling and Associates Fine Photography, Chicago, 1923. Written in elegant script on the reverse, Catherine, 28, Virginia, 24, spring portrait. At first glance, the photograph epitomized the sophistication and prosperity of 1920s America. The younger woman, Virginia, sat gracefully in an ornate wingback chair, wearing a fashionable dropped-waist dress of pale silk with intricate beadwork. Her bobbed hair was perfectly styled in the Marcel waves, popular during the Jazz Age, and her expression radiated the confident optimism characteristic of the era's modern women. Standing behind her was Catherine, dressed in a more conservative dark navy ensemble with pearls and a subtle brooch. Her clothing, while expensive, appeared more formal and traditional than her sister's contemporary style. Catherine's posture was impeccable, her hands positioned with the practiced grace of someone trained in proper deportment. Yet something about Catherine's expression troubled Dr. Walsh profoundly. While her mouth curved in an appropriate social smile, her eyes held an intensity that seemed incompatible with the portrait's celebratory nature. There was a desperation there, a barely controlled panic that contrasted sharply with Virginia's genuine contentment. The lighting in the Sterling studio had been expertly arranged to flatter both subjects, but it also revealed subtle details that deepened Walsh's curiosity. Catherine's knuckles appeared white where she gripped the back of Virginia's chair, suggesting tension that contradicted her composed exterior. More intriguingly, while Virginia wore a wedding ring, Catherine's hands were bare, unusual for a woman of her apparent social standing during an era when marriage was the expected path for well-bred ladies. Dr. Walsh had examined thousands of period photographs during her career as a specialist in early 20th century American portraiture, but few had affected her so immediately. The technical quality was excellent, the subjects were obviously prosperous. Yet Catherine's expression suggested circumstances far more complex than a simple family celebration. As Walsh studied the photograph under magnification that evening, she noticed other subtle anomalies. Virginia's jewelry appeared newer and more elaborate than Catherine's, despite the older sister's apparently superior social position. Catherine's dress, while well-made, showed subtle signs of alteration and careful maintenance that weren't evident in Virginia's obviously new ensemble. Most disturbing was the way Catherine's eyes seemed to focus not on the camera, but on something beyond the frame, as if she were monitoring a situation that demanded her constant attention even during this formal portrait session. Dr. Walsh's investigation began with Sterling and Associates, Chicago's most exclusive photography studio during the 1920s. Founded by British émigré William Sterling in 1918, the studio had built its reputation photographing Chicago's social elite, including prominent business families, political figures, and wealthy society matrons. The Chicago History Museum's archives contained extensive records from Sterling's studio, including appointment books, correspondence, and William Sterling's personal notes about challenging sessions and unusual clients. The entry for the portrait session revealed immediate concerns about the circumstances surrounding the photograph. Sterling's appointment book for April 15, 1923 noted, Pemberton sisters, special sitting, payment in advance by younger sister, older sister, appeared reluctant throughout consultation. The photographer had also marked the session with an asterisk, indicating it required special attention or had presented unusual circumstances. Sterling's personal photography journal contained more detailed observations that explained his concerns about the session. The Pemberton sisters presented a study in contrasts today, he had written. Virginia Pemberton Davies arrived confident and animated, clearly excited about the portrait session. However, Catherine Pemberton seemed distressed throughout the consultation, frequently checking her watch and appearing anxious about the time required. The photographer had noted unusual family dynamics during the session. Virginia insisted on specific poses and arrangements, while Catherine deferred to her younger sister's preferences, despite being the elder. When I attempted to adjust Catherine's positioning for better lighting, she startled notably and apologized repeatedly for being difficult. Most significantly, Sterling had documented his professional concerns about Catherine's emotional state during the session. Catherine Pemberton maintained perfect composure and social grace, but her eyes betrayed significant distress. As an experienced portraitist, I recognized the difference between momentary nervousness and deep-seated anxiety. This woman appeared to be managing circumstances that extended far beyond our studio session. Sterling's notes revealed that he had made multiple attempts to capture a natural expression from Catherine, but her forced smile and tense posture remained consistent throughout the lengthy session. Catherine's responses were overly apologetic and deferential, unusual for a woman of her apparent breeding and social position. She seemed to expect criticism or correction for normal behavior. The photographer had also observed the sisters' interaction with particular interest. Virginia treated Catherine with what appeared to be affectionate condescension, frequently speaking for her and making decisions about the portrait arrangements. Catherine accepted this treatment without question, though her discomfort was evident in her rigid posture and controlled breathing. Sterling's final notes about the session were prophetic. "I fear this portrait may document circumstances that neither sister intended to reveal. Catherine's expression suggests someone managing a crisis while maintaining social appearances, a performance that may be exhausting to sustain." The studio's financial records revealed that Virginia had indeed paid for the session in advance and had requested multiple copies of the final portrait, unusual for family photographs of the era. Sterling had noted that Catherine had seemed surprised by these arrangements, suggesting she may not have been fully informed about the session's purpose or scope. Dr. Walsh's research into the Pemberton family revealed a story of wealth, social prominence, and carefully concealed family secrets that had shaped both sisters' lives in dramatically different ways. The family had been among Chicago's most influential residents during the early 1900s, with patriarch Robert Pemberton controlling a vast shipping empire that dominated Great Lakes commerce. Robert Pemberton had built Pemberton Shipping from a single cargo vessel in 1885 into one of the Midwest's largest transportation companies by 1920. The family's success had afforded them a mansion on Chicago's exclusive Gold Coast, where they entertained politicians, business magnates, and international visitors throughout the city's rapid growth period. However, Dr. Walsh discovered that the family's prosperity had come at significant personal cost, particularly for the women. Robert Pemberton had been notorious among Chicago's business community for his controlling nature and rigid expectations for his family's behavior. His wife, Margaret Pemberton, had died in 1918 under circumstances that had generated whispered speculation among society circles. Margaret's death had left Catherine, then 23, responsible for managing the family's social obligations, while caring for her younger sister Virginia, who was still finishing her education at an exclusive finishing school. Contemporary newspaper accounts portrayed Catherine as a devoted daughter who had sacrificed her own marriage prospects to maintain the family's social standing and oversee Virginia's debut into society. Yet Walsh's investigation revealed that Catherine's situation was more complex than the society pages suggested. Probate records from Robert Pemberton's death in 1922 showed that he had structured his will in ways that ensured Catherine's continued dependence on the family while providing Virginia with immediate access to significant wealth upon her marriage. The terms of Robert Pemberton's will were particularly revealing. While Virginia inherited substantial liquid assets and property, Catherine received only a modest annual allowance that would cease if she married without family approval or if she moved more than 50 miles from Chicago. The will effectively trapped Catherine in a role as family caretaker while ensuring Virginia's financial independence. Dr. Walsh found evidence that these arrangements had been deliberately designed to prevent Catherine from pursuing her own life. Letters between Robert Pemberton and his lawyer, preserved in legal archives, revealed his intention to keep Catherine available as a companion for Virginia, while maintaining control over the family's reputation and social connection. More troubling was what Walsh discovered about the family's response to Catherine's attempts at independence. In 1921, Catherine had become engaged to Dr. Michael Harrison, a respected physician who had treated her mother during her final illness. However, the engagement had been broken suddenly, with society columnists attributing the split to incompatible expectations about family obligations. Walsh found correspondence suggesting that Virginia had played a crucial role in ending Catherine's engagement. Letters between Virginia and her friends revealed her concerns about losing Catherine's support and companionship if the marriage proceeded. Virginia had successfully convinced their father to use his influence to pressure Dr. Harrison's medical practice, effectively forcing him to choose between his career and his relationship with Catherine. By 1923, Catherine found herself trapped in a situation where her younger sister controlled her financial security, social position, and personal relationships. The portrait captured Catherine at a moment when this reality had become inescapable, her desperate eyes reflecting the understanding that her own life had been sacrificed to ensure Virginia's happiness and security. Dr. Walsh's investigation into Chicago society, publications from the early 1920s, revealed a carefully constructed public narrative about the Pemberton sisters that contrasted sharply with the private reality documented in the photograph. Society columnists consistently portrayed Catherine as a devoted sister who had chosen family loyalty over personal ambitions, while Virginia was celebrated as the family's bright future. The Chicago Tribune Society pages from 1923 frequently mentioned both sisters, but their coverage revealed telling disparities in how they were described. Virginia was invariably referred to as the charming Mrs. Davies, or the vivacious Virginia Pemberton Davies, emphasizing her marriage to wealthy banker Charles Davies and her active participation in charity events and social gatherings. Catherine, however, was consistently described in relation to her sister's activities rather than her own accomplishments. She appeared in society columns as Virginia's devoted sister Catherine, or the faithful Miss Pemberton, language that emphasized her supportive role rather than her individual identity. Dr. Walsh discovered that this coverage was not accidental. Virginia had cultivated relationships with several society columnists, providing them with information about family activities while carefully controlling how Catherine was portrayed in print. Correspondence between Virginia and Chicago Herald Society editor Mrs. Florence Wellington revealed Virginia's active management of the family's public image. Catherine prefers to remain in the background supporting family activities rather than seeking attention for herself. Virginia had written to Mrs. Wellington in 1922, "She finds fulfillment in ensuring that our social obligations are met with appropriate dignity. I believe this reflects her naturally modest and self-sacrificing nature." However, Walsh found evidence that Catherine's preference for remaining in the background was not entirely voluntary. Private letters between Chicago society matrons revealed concerns about Catherine's increasingly withdrawn behavior at social events. Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, a family friend, had written to her sister in 1923, "Catherine Pemberton appears exhausted at every social function, though she maintains perfect composure. One senses that she is performing her role rather than enjoying these gatherings." More revealing were observations about the sisters' interaction during public events. Multiple sources noted that Catherine seemed to defer to Virginia's preferences even in matters where she should have had authority as the elder sister. Mrs. Harrison Blackwood, a prominent Gold Coast hostess, had recorded her concerns in a personal diary. "Virginia speaks for Catherine in most social situations, making decisions about their attendance at events and their participation in charitable activities. Catherine accepts these arrangements with grace, but her eyes suggest someone who has resigned herself to circumstances beyond her control." The society pages also revealed subtle signs of Catherine's isolation within Chicago's elite circles. While Virginia was frequently mentioned as hosting or co-hosting social gatherings, Catherine was rarely credited with organizing events despite being responsible for much of the actual work involved in entertaining. Dr. Walsh found evidence that Catherine had attempted to establish her own identity within Chicago society through involvement with women's educational charities, an area where she had demonstrated both passion and competence. However, these efforts had been consistently overshadowed by Virginia's more visible social activities, leaving Catherine's contributions largely unrecognized. The 1923 portrait session had taken place during a period when Virginia was planning her first major social event as a married woman, a charity benefit that would establish her position among Chicago's young society matrons. Catherine's desperate expression may have reflected her understanding that this event would further solidify her role as Virginia's supporter rather than an independent social presence. Dr. Walsh's investigation led her to the medical archives of Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of Chicago's few female physicians during the 1920s, and a doctor who had treated several prominent society women. Dr. Hartwell's patient records, preserved at Northwestern University's Medical History Collection, contain detailed notes about Catherine Pemberton's physical and emotional condition during the period surrounding the portrait session. Dr. Hartwell had begun treating Catherine in late 1922, initially for what appeared to be stress-related physical symptoms. Her medical notes revealed a pattern of ailments that suggested chronic anxiety and emotional suppression rather than any underlying medical condition. Miss Catherine Pemberton presents with persistent headaches, digestive difficulties, and chronic fatigue that cannot be attributed to physical causes, Dr. Hartwell had noted in January 1923. Patient exhibits symptoms consistent with prolonged emotional strain. Her manner during consultations is overly deferential, and she consistently minimizes her symptoms despite obvious distress. Dr. Hartwell's observations about Catherine's behavior during medical visits were particularly revealing. Miss Pemberton appears to expect criticism or disapproval for seeking medical attention. She apologizes repeatedly for bothering me with her complaints and seems surprised when I treat her symptoms as legitimate medical concerns rather than character weaknesses. The physician had noted that Catherine's symptoms worsened during periods when she was expected to participate in family social obligations or when Virginia required additional support for her activities. Patients' physical complaints intensify when discussing family responsibilities, particularly those related to her sister's social engagements and household management duties. Dr. Hartwell's medical notes from March 1923, just weeks before the portrait session, documented Catherine's deteriorating emotional state. Miss Pemberton exhibits classic symptoms of what I can only describe as chronic despair. She reports difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, and an overwhelming sense that her life lacks purpose or direction. When questioned about her personal goals and interests, she becomes visibly distressed and states that such considerations would be selfish, given her family obligations. The physician had attempted to address Catherine's situation delicately, recognizing the social constraints that limited her treatment options. I have suggested that Miss Pemberton might benefit from reduced social obligations and increased personal independence, but she insists that such changes would be impossible, given her family's expectations and financial arrangements. Dr. Hartwell's notes revealed that she had grown increasingly concerned about Catherine's psychological well-being. Patient demonstrates signs of what modern psychology might recognize as learned helplessness. She has accepted limitations on her personal autonomy that are causing significant psychological damage, yet she seems unable to imagine alternatives to her current situation. Most significantly, Dr. Hartwell had documented her suspicion that Catherine was experiencing a form of psychological abuse within her family system. While Miss Pemberton's sister and family treat her with apparent affection and respect, the structure of their relationships ensures her continued dependence and prevents her from developing independent adult relationships. This dynamic, while socially acceptable, may be profoundly damaging to her emotional development. The physician's final notes about Catherine before the portrait session were prescient. Miss Pemberton's controlled demeanor masks profound emotional distress. I fear that her learned ability to suppress her authentic feelings and needs may eventually lead to more serious psychological consequences if her circumstances do not change. Dr. Hartwell had prescribed mild sedatives for Catherine's anxiety and insomnia, but her notes indicated that medication could only address symptoms rather than the underlying family dynamics that were causing Catherine's distress. Dr. Walsh's most significant breakthrough came when she located descendants of Margaret O'Brien, who had worked as head housekeeper for the Pemberton family from 1920 to 1925. Margaret's granddaughter, Patricia O'Brien Murphy, had inherited a collection of letters that provided intimate insights into daily life in the Pemberton household during the period leading up to the portrait session. Margaret O'Brien's letters to her sister in Ireland revealed a household where emotional manipulation and financial control had created a toxic environment for Catherine, despite the family's outward appearance of harmony and prosperity. Miss Catherine is like a bird in a gilded cage, Margaret had written in February 1923. She manages all the household affairs and social arrangements, but Mrs. Davies makes all the decisions about how things should be done. Miss Catherine works from morning until night, ensuring everything meets Mrs. Davies' standards, but she receives little recognition for her efforts. Margaret's observations about the sisters' relationship were particularly revealing. Mrs. Davies treats Miss Catherine with what appears to be sisterly affection, but she controls every aspect of her life. Miss Catherine cannot make social plans, purchase clothing, or even choose her daily activities without Mrs. Davies' approval. It's presented as consultation, but Miss Catherine's preferences are rarely honored. The housekeeper had documented specific incidents that illustrated the psychological pressure Catherine faced daily. Yesterday, Miss Catherine suggested changes to the menu for Mrs. Davies' dinner party. Mrs. Davies agreed that the suggestions were excellent, then spent an hour explaining why they wouldn't work and suggesting alternatives that were nearly identical to Miss Catherine's original ideas. Miss Catherine accepted these changes graciously, but I could see her disappointment. Margaret's letters revealed that Catherine's isolation extended beyond her relationship with Virginia. Miss Catherine rarely receives visitors who come to see her specifically. Most callers are Mrs. Davies' friends or business associates. When Miss Catherine attempts to maintain friendships from before Mrs. Davies' marriage, she's often unavailable due to sudden household emergencies that require her immediate attention. The housekeeper had observed Catherine's deteriorating emotional condition throughout early 1923. Miss Catherine has grown thinner and more withdrawn each month. She often stares out the windows for long periods, particularly when Mrs. Davies is hosting social events. She seems to be watching life pass by rather than participating in it. Margaret's most disturbing observations concerned Catherine's response to any suggestion that she might deserve better treatment. When I mentioned that Miss Catherine might enjoy having her own social activities, she became quite distressed and insisted that her family obligations were more important than personal pleasure. She seems to believe that wanting independence or recognition would be selfish and ungrateful. The housekeeper had witnessed the preparation for the portrait session and documented Catherine's anxiety about the upcoming appointment. Miss Catherine spent days worrying about how to dress for the photographs. Mrs. Davies made most of the decisions about clothing and arrangements, but Miss Catherine seemed concerned about meeting expectations that were never clearly explained to her. Margaret's final observation about the portrait session was particularly insightful. Miss Catherine returned from the photographer's studio looking exhausted, though the appointment lasted only a few hours. When I asked if the session had gone well, she said it was fine, but spent the rest of the day in her room. Mrs. Davies seemed very pleased with the arrangements and spoke of ordering multiple copies to send to relatives and friends. The letters revealed that Margaret O'Brien had grown protective of Catherine and concerned about the long-term consequences of her situation, but felt powerless to intervene given the family's social position and her own employment vulnerability. Dr. Walsh discovered a crucial piece of evidence in the Northwestern University archives, a letter written by Catherine's former finishing school roommate, Helen Morrison Clark, to her own sister in April 1923, the same month as the portrait session. The letter provided an outsider's perspective on Catherine's deteriorating situation and revealed attempts at intervention that had been unsuccessful. Helen had maintained a friendship with Catherine, despite Virginia's subtle discouragement of relationships that predated her marriage to Charles Davies. Her letter revealed deep concern about changes she had observed in her former friend during recent visits to Chicago. Catherine is not the vibrant, intelligent woman I knew at school, Helen had written. She seems to have disappeared behind a mask of perfect propriety and selfless devotion to her sister's needs. When I try to discuss her own interests or future plans, she redirects the conversation to Virginia's activities and accomplishments. Helen's observations about the sisters' interaction during social visits were particularly disturbing. Virginia speaks for Catherine in most situations, Even when the questions are directed specifically at Catherine, when Catherine does express an opinion, Virginia often corrects or clarifies her statements, explaining what Catherine really means, or providing context that subtly undermines Catherine's credibility. The letter revealed that Helen had attempted to invite Catherine for an extended visit to her home in Boston, hoping to provide her friend with temporary respite from family pressures. I suggested that Catherine might enjoy a change of scenery and offered to host her for several weeks. Virginia immediately intervened, explaining that Catherine's household responsibilities made such a trip impossible. Catherine agreed with this assessment, but I could see longing in her eyes when we discussed Boston's cultural offerings and social opportunities. Helen had also documented her concerns about Catherine's financial dependence on Virginia. Catherine mentioned needing to ask Virginia's permission before purchasing a new dress for an upcoming social event. When I expressed surprise that a 28-year-old woman would need such approval, Catherine explained that Virginia manages all family finances and prefers to approve expenditures to ensure appropriate choices. This arrangement seems designed to maintain control rather than provide practical assistance. Most significantly, Helen had noticed the same desperate expression in Catherine's eyes that would be captured in the portrait session. Catherine's smile has become a performance rather than an expression of genuine emotion. Her eyes hold a sadness and desperation that she tries to hide behind perfect manners and cheerful conversation. I fear my friend is disappearing entirely behind the role she has been assigned within her family. Helen's letter revealed that she had attempted to discuss Catherine's situation with mutual friends from their school days, hoping to organize some form of intervention or support. Our classmates who have seen Catherine recently share my concerns about her well-being. However, Virginia has successfully cultivated relationships with many of these women, and they are reluctant to challenge what appears to be family harmony maintained by Catherine's voluntary sacrifice. The letter concluded with Helen's growing frustration about her inability to help her friend. Catherine insists that she is content with her role supporting Virginia's happiness and success. She claims that marriage and independent life held no appeal for her, and that she finds fulfillment in family service. Yet every word of this assertion contradicts what I know about her dreams and ambitions when we were younger. Helen's final observation was particularly poignant. I fear that Catherine has convinced herself that her sacrifice is noble and necessary, but I believe she is slowly dying inside while maintaining the appearance of gracious contentment. The woman I see now bears little resemblance to the passionate, intelligent girl who once spoke of changing the world through education and social reform. As Dr. Walsh compiled her research, she began to understand that the 1923 portrait had captured a pivotal moment in Catherine's psychological imprisonment. A woman who had been systematically isolated from independence and authentic relationships, while being praised for her selfless devotion to family. The photograph preserved visual evidence of emotional abuse that was both sophisticated and socially acceptable during the era. Consulting with Dr. Maria Santos, a contemporary psychologist specializing in family dynamics and emotional abuse, Walsh gained modern insights into the patterns documented in Catherine's case. Dr. Santos's analysis revealed how Virginia and the family system had created a form of psychological control that was nearly impossible for Catherine to recognize or escape. Catherine's situation represents classic emotional manipulation disguised as family loyalty, Dr. Santos explained. Virginia maintained control through a combination of financial dependency, social isolation, and emotional guilt, while presenting these arrangements as natural expressions of sisterly love and family tradition. Dr. Santos was particularly struck by the visual evidence preserved in the photograph. Catherine's desperate eyes reflect what we now recognize as learned helplessness combined with complex trauma responses. Her maintained composure demonstrates sophisticated survival mechanisms developed to navigate an emotionally unsafe environment where authentic feelings were dangerous to express. The psychologist noted how Catherine's situation had been enabled by social expectations of the 1920s. Society celebrated Catherine's sacrifice while ignoring the psychological cost. Her role as devoted sister was seen as noble rather than tragic, making it nearly impossible for her to seek help or even recognize her own victimization. Walsh realized that the photograph served as historical documentation of psychological abuse within wealthy families during an era when such concepts were not widely understood. Catherine's story revealed how financial control, social manipulation, and emotional coercion could trap capable adults in situations that destroyed their psychological well-being while appearing virtuous to outside observers. The evidence Walsh had gathered painted a clear picture of Catherine's daily reality. Living with a sister whose affection was conditional on complete compliance, managing household responsibilities without authority or recognition, and maintaining social appearances while being systematically prevented from developing independent relationships or pursuing personal goals. The photographer William Sterling had unknowingly captured the moment when all of Catherine's psychological defenses were visible simultaneously. Her practiced smile demonstrated her ability to meet social expectations, while her desperate eyes revealed the cost of maintaining such rigid control over her authentic self. Walsh discovered that the portrait had been the last formal photograph taken of the sisters together. Within months of the session, circumstances would change dramatically for Catherine. though not in ways that anyone present during that spring day in Sterling's studio could have anticipated. The photograph now stood as testimony to Catherine's resilience in maintaining her sanity while navigating impossible circumstances, and as evidence of how institutional and social failures could abandon capable women whose suffering was hidden behind facades of family harmony and social respectability. Catherine's story demonstrated how emotional abuse could flourish within relationships that appeared loving and supportive to outside observers, particularly when financial dependence and social isolation prevented victims from accessing alternative perspectives or support systems. Catherine's story demonstrated how emotional abuse could flourish within relationships that appeared loving and supportive to outside observers, particularly when financial dependence and social isolation prevented victims from accessing alternative perspectives or support systems. Dr. Walsh's research into Catherine's later life revealed a remarkable story of eventual liberation and self-discovery that began with an unexpected tragedy in 1924. Virginia's sudden death from influenza that winter, while devastating to Chicago society, paradoxically provided Catherine with the first opportunity for independence she had experienced since childhood. Virginia's death had initially thrown Catherine into deeper despair, but it also removed the primary source of control and manipulation that had defined her adult life. Charles Davies, Virginia's widowed husband, proved to be far more supportive of Catherine's autonomy than his late wife had been, recognizing the sacrifices Catherine had made for their family's stability. Letters between Catherine and her friend Helen Morrison Clark, preserved in family archives, documented Catherine's gradual emergence from the psychological prison that had constrained her for years. "I feel as though I am awakening from a long, strange dream," Catherine had written to Helen in spring 1924. "For the first time in years, I can make decisions about my day without consulting anyone or anticipating disapproval." Catherine's transformation was initially tentative and marked by guilt about experiencing freedom after Virginia's death. However, with support from Charles Davies and encouragement from friends like Helen, she began to explore interests and relationships that had been suppressed for years. By 1925, Catherine had moved into her own apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood and begun working with a women's educational charity, the same type of organization she had been interested in before her family obligations overwhelmed her personal aspirations. Her colleagues noted her intelligence, organizational skills, and deep empathy for women facing difficult circumstances. Catherine's personal papers, donated to the Chicago History Museum after her death in 1958, revealed her growing understanding of the psychological dynamics that had trapped her for years. She had kept a detailed journal throughout her recovery process, documenting insights about family manipulation, financial control, and the social pressures that had enabled her sister's behavior. "I realize now that Virginia's love was conditional on my compliance and self-sacrifice," Catherine wrote in 1926. "What I interpreted as natural family affection was actually a sophisticated form of control that prevented me from developing an independent adult identity. The tragedy is that Virginia may not have recognized the damage she was causing, believing genuinely that our arrangement was mutually beneficial." Catherine's work with the women's charity had brought her into contact with other women who had experienced similar family dynamics, helping her recognize that her situation had not been unique or inevitable. She had become particularly effective at identifying and assisting women who were trapped in psychologically abusive relationships, disguised as family loyalty or romantic devotion. By the 1930s, Catherine had become a respected advocate for women's independence and financial literacy, frequently speaking to groups about the importance of economic autonomy and the dangers of family systems that discouraged individual development. Her advocacy work was informed by personal experience, but focused on helping others avoid similar psychological traps. Catherine had eventually married in 1932, at age 37, to Dr. Robert Mitchell, a widowed physician who respected her independence and supported her charitable work. Their relationship, based on mutual respect and shared interests, provided Catherine with her first experience of healthy adult partnership. In her personal writings, Catherine reflected extensively on the 1923 portrait that had captured her at her lowest point. "That photograph shows a woman who had learned to smile while dying inside," she wrote in a 1940 journal entry. "My eyes in that image reflect the desperation of someone who had given up hope of ever living authentically. I keep it as a reminder of how completely one can lose oneself while appearing to maintain perfect composure." Catherine's transformation demonstrated that recovery from long-term psychological manipulation was possible, though it required years of careful self-examination and the support of people who recognized her intrinsic worth rather than her usefulness to others. Dr. Walsh's investigation concluded with a profound understanding of how the 1923 portrait served as both historical document and cautionary tale about the subtle forms of emotional abuse that could flourish within seemingly respectable family relationships. Catherine Pemberton's story revealed how financial control, social manipulation, and emotional coercion could trap capable adults in situations that destroyed their psychological well-being while appearing virtuous to society. When Walsh presented her findings to the Chicago Women's History Project, she emphasized how Catherine's desperate eyes and forced smile had preserved evidence of suffering that the social conventions of the 1920s had made invisible. The photograph captured a moment when a 28-year-old woman was compelled to perform contentment while navigating an emotionally devastating family dynamic. This image teaches us to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating family relationships, Walsh explained to the gathered historians and social workers. Catherine's composed exterior masked profound psychological distress that was systematically ignored because her sacrifice was socially celebrated rather than questioned. The photograph had acquired new significance as documentation of how institutional and social systems could fail to protect capable adults whose autonomy was being systematically undermined by those who claimed to love them. It demonstrated the importance of recognizing emotional abuse, even when it occurred within relationships that appeared caring and supportive to outside observers. Walsh's research revealed that Catherine had used her later platform as an advocate to educate others about recognizing and escaping psychologically controlling relationships. Throughout her career, she'd spoken openly about the importance of financial independence and the warning signs of emotional manipulation disguised as family devotion. The Chicago Women's Advocacy Center had incorporated Catherine's story into their training programs for social workers, counselors, and financial advisors who work with women in controlling family situations. The 1923 portrait was used to teach recognition of psychological distress that might be hidden behind socially acceptable facades of family harmony. Catherine's personal papers included correspondence with numerous women who had contacted her after learning about her experiences through her advocacy work. Her responses demonstrated her continued commitment to helping others recognize that apparent family devotion could mask sophisticated forms of emotional abuse. The photograph now resides in the Chicago History Museum's permanent collection, displayed alongside Walsh's research and Catherine's own reflections on her transformation from victim to advocate. Visitors often spend considerable time studying Catherine's face, learning to see beyond her practiced smile to recognize the signs of psychological distress that had been invisible to most observers of her era. Walsh's final report concluded, Catherine Pemberton's story reminds us that emotional abuse can flourish within relationships that appear loving and supportive, particularly when financial dependence and social isolation prevent victims from accessing alternative perspectives. Her eventual liberation and transformation into an advocate for women's independence demonstrates that recovery is possible with proper support and recognition of one's intrinsic worth. The 1923 portrait continues to serve as both memorial to Catherine's years of psychological imprisonment and celebration of her courage in rebuilding her life after Virginia's death. Her legacy reminds us that true family love supports individual growth and independence rather than demanding self-sacrifice and compliance, and that communities must look more carefully at situations where one person's happiness appears to require another's diminishment.